Thank you so much. It's always an honor to be speaking in front of so many people who are interested in history. I love history very much. I guess I'll tell you a little bit about myself. My name is George Diaz, and I'm originally from Laredo, Texas. My parents were both teachers, and I'll tell you a little bit about, I guess, how I got my name. I'm named after my father, and my father is George Diaz, and the reason for that is because in Laredo, Texas, they celebrate George Washington's birthday. So going back to the 19th century, they celebrated George Washington's birthday with a big parade. And my father was born on the day of the parade. And the doctor that helped deliver my father made some kind of joke to my grandmother, saying something like, "This kid, we should name him George because I'm missing the parade for, helping give birth, deliver this kid." So my father's name George, which was very fortuitous for me because if it hadn't been that, he would have been named after the day he was born on, which would have been Valentine's Day. And then he would have been Valentino Diaz, and I would have been Valentino Diaz, and my life would be far different. But anyway, my name is George, and because I'm from Laredo. So Laredo is in South Texas. It's the largest inland port in the United States, and it's a little bit upriver from here. I have a map, and I'll show it to you in a second. So anyway, that's where I'm from. And like I said, my parents are teachers, and I always liked education a lot. And I knew I always wanted to go into history. So anyway, I thought when I was going to school that I wanted to study something really old. So I liked Egypt, and I liked Turkey and Mesopotamia. I really liked the old stuff. But then I realized when I was going to school that to study those cultures and those ancient civilizations, it requires a lot of language training. And I didn't know Greek or these other languages that I would have to know to master that. So I thought, well, what can I study that's closer to home using the languages that I knew, which was English and some Spanish. So anyway, that kind of narrowed me down to study the US-Mexico borderlands, which is where I'm from. So anyway, I was working on my master's thesis in history because I knew I wanted to be a professor, and the first step in doing that was to work on a master's thesis. And that's basically a 120-page paper on a topic you really like a lot, because if you don't like it, you shouldn't be studying that for writing a 120-page paper on it. So anyway, I was in Laredo working on my master's thesis, and I was trying to think of a topic related to local history because that's what I had access to. I couldn't go off far away to do research because I didn't have the money to do that. So I thought, okay, I'm going to study the borderlands. Well, what can I study about the borderlands that's interesting, something that had not been done before? And I thought about the Civil War in South Texas, and I realized that my advisor had written a book on that. And then like the Mexican Revolution's impact on South Texas, someone else had written a book about that. So I was thinking like, what can I study about the borderlands that had not really been researched by historians before? And I thought, well, what's really interesting that's always in the news is smuggling or illicit trade. So like I said, I was born in the 1980s. I grew up in South Texas. And just growing up in South Texas, there's a lot of things I saw with my own eyes in terms of just like, things that kind of got my interest in the topic, and also was always in the evening news. And I guess I'll tell you another little story. When I was a kid growing up in South Texas, we'd walk around downtown South Texas, and there were a lot of empty boxes in the streets of Laredo, like empty boxes like, VCRs, TVs, these kind of things. And I'm like, why are all these empty boxes downtown Laredo? And my mom told me that one of the things that happens in the 80s is that the import duties in Mexico were very high for electronics, for TVs, for VCRs, and these kind of things. And a lot of people would buy these items downtown and then take them out of the box and take them into Mexico as used items because the taxes were so high. So they were doing things like that. And that's just basically trying to get around taxes. But that's like illicit trade, even though what's being brought in was not an illegal item. It's just, the trade taxes were so high, as much as 30-40%. So anyway, I took my topic to my advisor. His name was Jerry Thompson. He wrote a lot about the Civil War in the Southwest. And I told him I want to study smuggling. He said, well, that's a great topic, but when? Like the border is 150 years old. It was created in 1848 after the US-Mexico War. And perhaps you can narrow down that topic. So I was thinking like, how can I narrow down this topic? And I thought a good way to do that is to study a narrow period of time. And I decided to study the period of Prohibition. Prohibition is the period in US history in which alcohol was effectively, it was prohibited to sell or transport intoxicating liquor. And this has to do with what's it called? The 19th Amendment to the Constitution, which is basically prohibition. Wait, no, I'm sorry. It's the 18th Amendment. I get confused. So anyway, between the 1919 and 1933, alcohol was effectively prohibited in the United States. That being said, people still wanted alcohol because they enjoyed it. So anyway, I went to the library to study. The first thing you do when you're doing research is to see what other people have written about a topic, right? So I went to the library looking for books about the history of smuggling and the history of prohibition. And in terms of like smuggling, a lot of stuff about the US-Mexico border was about the contemporary period, like narcotics. It was written by journalists and political scientists, but nothing about the history of smuggling over time and how it developed. And in terms of the history of prohibition, like the Al Capone era, a lot of stuff had to do with the Canadian border rather than the Mexican border. So I went to my advisor and I told him, like, look, there's not a lot of information about this topic because, it's just not been researched. He said, that's a good thing because there's no one done research on it. You could do something that's really original. So this is what I did to do my research. Well, one of the things I did is I went through, I did some readings and I found out that one of the things that happened during that time is that anytime something is banned and people still want it, it creates an opportunity for people who are entrepreneurs, let's say. So when alcohol was prohibited in the United States, it did not end the demand. It was simply impossible to get legally. So what happens is alcohol was still available in Mexico, and there were some local people who often are just called tequileros, or just called liquor smugglers, tequila smugglers, who purchased alcohol in Mexico and transported it into the United States and sold it to people who wanted it. This is a painting by Frank Tenney Johnson. It sounds kind of Frenchified, Contrabandista a la frontera. And it basically shows like liquor smugglers coming from Mexico with alcohol packed on the back of donkeys. And they're basically making a trade-off out in the desert somewhere. So let's talk a little bit about this. So I like this map a lot. And this is a really amazing map that I found. So check this out. This map shows reputed smuggling routes from Mexico into the United States during the era of Prohibition. So let me tell you a little bit about where this map came from. I didn't actually make this map. This map is from a book called Horsebackers of the Brush Country is the name of the book. It's by a woman named Maud T. Gilliland. Maud T. Gilliland was the daughter of a Texas Ranger and also later on married a ranger herself, so she had a lot of rangers in her family. And she wrote this book called Horsebackers of the Brush Country back in the 1960s. And it's based on a lot of interviews with law enforcement agents. And basically based on those interviews, she created this map of liquor smuggling routes as understood by law enforcement. So one of the things you might notice is that if you're studying illicit activity, oftentimes the records that are available to historians are the records that are produced by law enforcement. Because, one of the things I learned to do in my research when I was a master's student is oftentimes people who are involved in illicit trade don't keep documentation of their activities for obvious reasons. So most times when we have evidence of illicit activity, it has to do with when there was an apprehension, a bust, an arrest, or these kind of things, because people who are involved in things don't like to, create evidence. So anyway, we'll go back to this map again in a little while. So studying smuggling is a very, very difficult thing because oftentimes when people are successful in their endeavors, there is no record. Most of the records I found were when there was an apprehension, there was an encounter, there was some violence between law enforcement, particularly Texas Rangers and the Customs Service. The Border Patrol was not created until 1924. So later on, you'll see the records, but at the very beginning, when Prohibition began, it's basically Texas Rangers and Customs agents. So I want to show a few more pictures. This is an image of Captain Wright. We'll go back to him in a minute, but I want to show you a little bit about tequileros. So tequileros is just Spanish for tequila runner or tequila transporter. And by and large, the individuals who were doing this were local men from rural backgrounds, ranching backgrounds, who saw an opportunity to make some money and went to Mexico to purchase alcohol where it was available legally and transport it to the United States where there was a market and they sold it for money to make some ends meet. This is a photo that is posed. You see some U.S. law enforcement with some men they captured who were involved in illicit trade. You can see that this is a posed photograph because obviously they stood in front of the camera and you can see the jugs of alcohol. So I want to talk a little bit about the efforts it took to do this kind of activity. So this is another image that is actually in the state archives in Austin. And this is Texas Rangers with basically apprehension of a mule train that they found out in the Monte. So it's Texas Rangers with 300 quarts of tequila and 37 seized animals, Northwest Duval County, November 21st, 1921. If you go back to this map, what happens is alcohol was purchased in Mexico legally. And if you know this region at all, it's a lot of thicket, it's a lot of brush country, it's a lot of monte. So this is thicket vegetation that's like 7-8 feet high. And if you don't know that area, like you're gonna get lost real easy. So these men would pack alcohol on the backs of mules or donkeys and then go through the brush country often at night. And if you notice what they're doing is they're actually trying to avoid contact because the whole point of smuggling is to evade detection. So oftentimes these men would work at night, and it's rather amazing because they would go like, 60, 70 miles all the way up to San Diego. And if you wonder why they're going there, it's because at that destination, once you get there with your 4 or 5 donkeys and 300 bottles, oftentimes you'd rendezvous with some bootleggers or men with trucks who are waiting for you, and then they buy the bottles off you wholesale, and they take it up to Corpus, they take it up to San Antonio, they take it up to Houston. So the tequileros are basically middlemen. They buy wholesale in Mexico, they rendezvous with some connections in San Diego who are waiting for them in trucks, and they drive up to major cities where it gets sold in speakeasies and those kind of places. But by and large, the guys who are operating out in the brush country, these tequileros, are doing this clandestinely. They're operating at night in small groups, 2 or 3 guys, and they're trying to avoid detection because the whole point of it is to not be encountered at all. That being said, the border is very, very policed because of the decade of the 1920s. The decade before, the 19-teens, was the decade of the Mexican Revolution. There was a lot of cross-border violence. There was a lot of activity in terms of like raiders crossing into the valley, and law enforcement responded to those raids with a great degree of violence, killing hundreds of suspects with minimal evidence. So what happens is oftentimes the decade later, a lot of those officers who were involved in the 19-teens in the matanza or in the killings, they didn't retire. They were still active in the 1920s. And they saw these smugglers in the 1920s as like another iteration of those raiders. That being said, liquor smugglers in the 1920s didn't attack like ranches. They were simply going at night trying to smuggle liquor and get back. So how do I know this? Well, I know this because of a couple of things. I know this because what I did find in the library was a lot of Texas Ranger memoirs. That's the kind of records that existed. So every now and then at the end of their service, a ranger like the adjutant general would retire and would leave a memoir. Our Texas Rangers would give memoirs and talk about their activity, and these become books, and it talks about their actions. And the reason why I know about this is because of newspapers. So back before things were Google searchable, I went to the library, and there was a lot of material that was on microfilm. Microfilm is basically photographs of old newspapers. So I went to the newspaper of my hometown from 1919 to 1933, and I just read all the newspapers looking for activity regarding, the policing of the border and law enforcement encounters with liquor smugglers. And I've been going through that, and every now and then I find a story, and then I write it down as an episode of the policing of prohibition. So anyway, I found these sources, and it's very, very informative. It talks about officers encountering a group of men out in the brush country, and there's an incident of violence, and at the end the suspects are killed and the alcohol is recovered. So anyway, after going through this material for quite a while, because I was researching my topic for months, I became aware that there was a significant kind of like gap in my research, because the material I was finding in terms of looking at newspapers and looking at Texas Ranger memoirs were from the perspective of law enforcement. So for instance, like for this newspaper, the journalists talked to the officers involved, and the officers involved told their story, and that was reported in the newspaper. And that was what I had to go with. And that was very, very informative, but I became aware that that's not like all the stories that are out there. So for instance, I was in a graduate class at my university. That's A&M International University in Laredo, Texas. And I was basically taking that graduate course, writing a paper on this topic. And the class only had about 6 or 7 people. And there was an older gentleman who said, you know, in Zapata's about a town that's about 60 miles from my hometown. This older gentleman in my class told me that there was a woman who lived in Zapata, and she is the sister of a famous liquor smuggler. And I'm like, what do you mean? And I'll tell you what I mean. There is a tradition along the border of folk songs or folk ballads. So every now and then something would happen and it would inspire a folk song. This is a Spanish language song that recounts a story in Spanish according to how locals remembered it. So I can just run over here and play just a little bit of the song because you can kind of hear a little bit of it. And then I'll go back to where I was. So let's see. Where'd it go? Oh no, it's over here. Okay, so I'm just gonna play like a first few seconds after this commercial break. Sorry. Do we have audio? So the song is called Los Tequileros, or the Tequila Runners. And that's just the first few lines of the song. Okay, so this is the line from the song, Los Tequileros. On the 3rd day of November, what a memorable day, the Rinches, which basically means like it's a derogatory term for law enforcement, on the other side of the river killed 3 tequila runners. And the song goes on, it talks about these men from Guerrero, or like from a Mexican village in Tamaulipas who cross into the United States. And they're looking for a man to help them. So there's 2 men, Jeronimo and Silvano, and they need a third because it's, you know, a lot of work. And they go to the home of a guy named Leandro. And Leandro is ill, and he says he doesn't want to go with them because he just doesn't feel up to it. But they persuade him to go because they say, hey, you can make some money. And when they go off they don't come back. They get killed doing that. And that's basically the song. And the song tells that version of the events. So anyway, when this guy in my class told me the story that there's a sister of this guy was still alive, I had to go talk to her. So like I went ahead and he gave me her phone number, and she had a little feed store in Zapata. And I said, hello, I'm a student. I'm working on my master's thesis. This is back in 2003. So this is, oh my goodness, that's 20 years ago I've been doing this. And she said, yes, that's my brother. Do you want to come over and I'll tell you the story about the time my brother went off to go smuggle alcohol and he didn't come back. So I brought her some pastry, some pan dulce, and she told me the story. And this is what she told me. She said, back in 1922, she was a young girl, and she knew the story because her mother told her. So she was 2 years old in 1922, but her mother told her the story, and that's how she knew the story. And the story she told me was basically what the song said verbatim, that it was cold, that these men came by that her brother knew. They asked him to go smuggle some liquor. He said he didn't want to go. He said he was sick. And they said, look, you can make some money. Join us. We'll cut you in. And he didn't come back. And that's effectively the story she told me. And then she told me, she asked me, would you like to see a photograph of my brother? And I said, I would be honored. Like, I can't believe it because this is this guy who's mentioned in the song, Los Tequileros, his name is Leandro. He gets killed. And I said, I would love to see his picture. And this is the picture she showed me. And what I love about this photograph is that it's his wedding picture. That's, you know, when I thought like she's gonna show me a picture of this guy who was in this ballad, who was a famous liquor smuggler, I thought he'd be holding a rifle and had like a hat. And that's not the picture she showed me. She showed me his wedding picture. And you know, he's just a guy. You know, he's just a guy. His wife had died a couple years earlier. He had some kids, and you know, they told him you could come with us and we'll cut you into in terms of like what we make in the alcohol run, and he didn't come back. So anyway, she told me that when he died in the hills of Mirando, like Mirando City, that the family was so afraid of the law enforcement officers, they didn't recover the body until decades later. He had been buried in a shallow grave. And anyway, later on in 2000, in the aughts, they finally gave him a proper burial after a funeral mass. And I went ahead and she said, if you go to the Zapata cemetery, you'll see my brother's grave. And the song is on the grave. And I went there and there's his monument and it has him and his wife that died before he did. And on the monument, which is, it's like the size of, it's like the size of this, right? Is the entire song. So this is what she told me. She told me that the artisan who made this monument did it at cost, just the cost of the material, rather than like take a profit for his labor, because he was so honored just to be a part of this local legend, this local story. And I myself was just in awe, and this would make me really want to become a professor of history, because like this person who was legendary, he was a name in the song, is here's his monument, there it is in stone. So anyway, I guess what did I do next? What I did next is, well, I'm a historian, right? So what I did is I took the date off the grave, right? And I'm like, okay, if he died then, and this is the song in Spanish, and that's how locals viewed it, how did the English language newspapers view it, right? So I went looking through all these old newspapers. I went through San Antonio newspapers, I went through Laredo newspapers, and I'm trying to make the connections between like, how does this side of the story compare to the other side of the story? And what I found out is I already had that, and it's this one. So why is the date different? Well, here it says December 24th. They were killed December 22nd is when they got killed. And the reason why that doesn't jive is because it doesn't rhyme in Spanish. So they were killed in December, but when the song is sung, there's some like artistic license, but I know it's the same event because it's the same men killed in the same place. So anyway, there are amazing differences between the song and English language versions of events. So the way I describe it is this. Y'all like sports? Y'all watch like a basketball, football, anything? It's like this. You ever see like a game and there's only one camera and the camera doesn't move and you can't zoom in or zoom out? That's all you get? That's how like a record is. All you see is what's on the page, but later on you might find like a different like angle on it, which gives you a bigger picture, right? And that doesn't mean this picture is incorrect. It just means it's part of the story. And then later on you get another picture and it gets, you get a fuller idea what's going on. So the more sources I got a fuller understanding of what happened. And it's amazing because it's the same story told two different ways. In the English language story, there's three guys who are smuggling and the three guys get killed. And then the Spanish language story, there's three guys who are out smuggling liquor and they get killed. But the way that story happens is very different, although they have the same outcomes, right? So in this one, like in this story, the officers encounter the guys who are smuggling liquor. They ask them to stop. The smugglers shoot first, and then the men die. In the ballad, it basically says that they were out smuggling liquor, and then they walk into an ambush, and the officers are waiting for them and shoot them down. And that's what the corrido says. So check it out. I'm trying to think like, how do these two different stories kind of compare? And this is where looking at things over years and years and years kind of makes a difference. So as I said, I've been going through all these newspaper clippings from 1919 through 1933. And what I found out is like by 1925, like the tequileros are these guys who are out there smuggling alcohol on the backs of animals. They're gone. There are no more of them. That doesn't mean smuggling ends. It just means now guys are using automobiles. Mm-hmm. Like by the middle of the 20s, there's no more guys out on horseback because they get killed off basically. But anyway, if you look at these stories that appear in like border newspapers like San Antonio, Laredo, it's always the kind of same story. Like the smugglers were out there, the officers find them, and then according to this source, the people who are suspects shoot first, and then the suspects die. But I'll tell you this, after going through all the newspapers from 1919 to 1933, I started counting like the bodies of these like encounters, like who actually died at the end of this. And in these encounters between mounted liquor smugglers and law enforcement, in terms of guys who are out on horseback, about 19 of these tequileros get killed. And in these encounters, which according to English language newspapers, the suspects shoot first, none of the officers are even wounded. None. Now later on, there are officers who are killed in the line of duty against liquor smugglers, but the ones who are killed by bootleggers, and those are guys in cars and trucks. And I'll tell you why. Because oftentimes when when officers that I found that were killed is when they pull over a vehicle and they're walking to the vehicle and the suspect's hands, you can't see them. So oftentimes there'd be like a weapon there and they would get killed. That's how Robert Rumsey got killed. Robert Rumsey was a mounted customs inspector who was killed around South Texas. And basically they pulled over a vehicle and he gets murdered. But it's not like the guys out on horseback doing the liquor smuggling. So anyway, it's a small world. Oftentimes officers in one organization would have friends and family in another organization. Oftentimes I move between organizations. So for instance, the Texas Rangers was a job that has a lot of like social cachet, but doesn't have a lot of actual pay. Oftentimes men who were in Texas Rangers wanted to become customs agents because it was a federal job with a pension and had a bigger budget. So Robert Rumsey used to be a Texas Ranger, then he became a customs agent. When he's killed as a federal customs agent, there were many Rangers who were upset that his killers had gotten away and began actively looking for people to pay for that crime. What's it called? Ranger Wright was someone who knew Robert Rumsey. Where's Ranger Wright? This is Ranger Wright right here. So anyway, Ranger Wright is the officer who led, I guess, the clash with tequileros around Miranda City. And basically, if you look at things like Walter Prescott Webb's 1935 book, The Texas Rangers, he talks about how, yeah, we got ahead of them and we waited for them. And then when they came in, we opened up on them. And he basically says that was his plan. So anyway, a couple more pictures. It's a picture of Mounted Customs Inspector Frank Smith, who went ahead and would often dispose of the alcohol. So oftentimes, if you look at these tequilero encounters, a lot of times these animals are packed with a lot of alcohol. So, people could put a couple hundred bottles on a mature mule or donkey. Oftentimes after the encounter, the bottles were destroyed, just smashed against the ground. Sometimes the alcohol was actually ignited. So after those 3 tequileros were killed in December of 1922, officers smashed hundreds of bottles and lit the pile. And for years, you could see the broken glass and like the bones of horses that were out there. So what was I saying? Anyway, let's keep on going. This is Silvano Gracia. He's one of the men who was mentioned in the song. He's reportedly the leader of the group of the 3 tequileros that were killed out in Miranda City. I like that he's wearing a tie. He dressed up for this photograph. So obviously he was someone who was well-to-do. Yeah, he has this pistol, right? But when I see him wearing a tie, it means that he has some money. That's what that tells me, or that's what indicates to me that he was a person of means. He was one of the men killed that day in Miranda City, around Zapata. So let's talk about how things change over time. So history is amazing because it has a lot of stories about the past, but history is also the study of change over time, right? So how did things transform? So by the mid-1920s, I could not find in the newspaper any more stories about men smuggling liquor out in the Monte. There were just no more of them. They were either killed or driven out of business. But that doesn't mean that phenomenon ended. It just means that there was another way that people found to get around that kind of law enforcement. So what I found is by the end of the 1920s, most of the liquor that I found that was being smuggled came by automobile, by cars and trucks along the state's road system, which oftentimes was superior because it allowed basically alcohol to be moved a lot further. There's only so far you can go on a mule or a donkey. Taking the alcohol in the back of a vehicle, you could go much further using the state's road system. By the 1927 and 1930s, at the very, very end of Prohibition, I found stories of alcohol being smuggled via airplanes. So alcohol being put in an aircraft, like a little, World War I surplus, and being driven, flown across the border. I found a number of stories of War I aviators who were arrested by customs agents having smuggled alcohol. And in terms of like who's doing this liquor smuggling in South Texas, these bootleggers, they're a little bit different. So let me tell you about Joe Hobrecht. Joe Hobrecht is a bootlegger, someone who was smuggling alcohol through, with automobiles. And Joe Hobrecht is a bootlegger, and he is one of the men listed as responsible for the murder of a Prohibition agent named Charles Stevens. So Charles Stevens was a Prohibition agent. He's a federal agent who around Pleasanton, around San Antonio, was looking for alcohol smuggling through the state road system around 1927. Basically there's a highway that goes from Laredo, which is from the border up to San Antonio, and along that artery there was and still illicit trade. So Officer Charles Stevens was trying to apprehend liquor smugglers, and while doing so, he gets killed, and the person who was charged and convicted of that was Joe Hobrecht. So why am I telling this story? I'm telling you this because, it shows change over time. Instead of like the use of horses along the border, now you see automobiles. And also a lot of these bootleggers were more violent, and in those encounters with law enforcement took a heavier toll on law enforcement than men out in the brush country. And also, I remember I told you that there is a tradition of border corridos or border folk songs. Well, if you look at these songs, these folk songs about tequileros, oftentimes they're valorized as people who are fighting against, discredited state agents, and they get killed, and it's a tragedy. But there's actually a folk song called El Corrido de Capitán Stevens, which is actually like a pro-law enforcement folk song that talked about how Captain Stevens was a man with panther's eyes and was like a noble guy who gets killed by this loathsome guy, this loathsome smuggler. So it's amazing because not all these folk songs are like anti-law enforcement. It has to do with the fact, there's like the Robin Hood story. There's some people who do like noble, law breaking versus people who are like seen as like dangerous, vile people, like Joe Hobrecht was. So anyway, I'll tell you a little bit about this cover. You know where I found this? I found this in the Smithsonian. And what this is basically an image of like weapons smuggling across the border. This is Mexican border, this is ammunition. And I'll tell you a funny story about this. This is actually an English language newspaper. But you know where that English language newspaper was recovered? It was recovered in 1945 in Germany, when US forces basically were there after World War II. And this is a clipping from World War I because the Kaiser had agents in Mexico who was monitoring the border in terms of arms smuggling into Mexico. That was taken by a German agent in World War I from Mexico and was found by US forces during World War II. And there's a little German stamp up in the corner. Anyway, but that's a little bit about that. I could talk about this forever, and I'll be happy to tell you about stories that are in the book or about my research. We have plenty of time for questions. Yes, ma'am.
The three guys that you showed early on. Now, did they have middlemen at that time, or were those guys going to Mexico and buying the liquor and doing the transporting, all of it?
So this is my understanding. Okay, in the song, 3 men are mentioned by name. There might have been more. And what my understanding is, when Prohibition came down, alcohol is illegal, and it created an opportunity for people who wanted to capitalize on that. So alcohol was legal in Mexico. So by and large, tequileros were middlemen, people who bought liquor in Mexico in bulk, because it's legal. You could buy it in stores. And then they would bring it into Mexico clandestine, bring it in from Mexico into the United States clandestinely, or they would smuggle it, by hiding it. But like what good is it going to do you? You have like all these bottles of liquor in South Texas. You have to take it to the market. So oftentimes they would put it, on horseback, and they would go like hundreds, like 60, 70 miles, and they would sell it to guys who would then take it up north. So the guys that I mentioned, Leandro and Silvano, are basically, they're small time, right? These are guys who went across, bought it, and then would turn around and sell it. And what that alcohol sold for in Houston, Dallas, Corpus, San Antonio was much higher. So these are the guys who are taking the biggest risk, because these are the guys who are risking their lives against, Texas Rangers and such. So that is my understanding of that aspect of the chain.
Okay, and so today, most smuggling, there's a boss, and then these picaderos or whatever are the lowman in the picture. Here they were kind of their boss also, the boss also.
Okay, so like this is really, really interesting, because like these are things that like I think I know, but I don't know, right? Because like I don't have like the ledger, right? Like the ledger where the guy who's masterminding everything keeps his accounts. What I think is these are just local guys who saw an opportunity, but they know someone who wants to buy. And I think at that level, it's more organized crime. I think these guys are just local guys who saw an opportunity, but they obviously know someone, because there's people waiting for them. They're not going to go out there and see who stops by, right? They have an appointment to make. And that's where it gets really, really, like that's just material that's like, how would you uncover that? Like through family memory? Like I don't know how to bridge that gap. So these guys are really low on they're not like sitting behind a desk somewhere. These are just local guys who saw a chance to make a little bit of money. Those other connections, it's kind of difficult to research, because it's the evidence, I don't know where that would be. Yes, ma'am.
I know that there really was only a small business in Canada for Canadian whiskey until Prohibition, and then it's continued to grow. Was this one of the big ways of making tequila popular in the United States?
That's an excellent question. So check this out. When I was doing research on smuggling, I was studying a lot about Prohibition, because obviously that was the time when there was a lot of rich material. So according to the Bureau of Prohibition, which is the federal agency that existed to enforce that law, the majority of alcohol that was smuggled from the United States into the United States comes from Canada. And the reason for that is really obvious, because, if you think about the time, most major American cities, where are they? Like they're up north, right? New York, Chicago, Portland, Seattle. So the major American cities border the Canadian border in a way that major American cities don't border the Mexican border. A lot of it has to do with just taste. Tequila did not become popular among like a lot of like Anglos in the United States until like the 1970s, when the frozen margarita machine was made. Like, I kid you not, like the frozen margarita machine is what made tequila popular in the United States. Prior to that, like that was not a common thing to drink tequila in the United States unless like you're Mexican American. So tequila's popularity in the United States really, really picked up in like the 1970s. But like during the Prohibition, a lot of the smuggling was along the Canadian border, and the Canadian border is a lot more violent. When you think about the violence that's going on in places like Chicago, like in Detroit, like a lot of like mob violence, like organized crime, that was far more violent than the Mexican border regarding that era of Prohibition. Yes, ma'am.
How much tunneling under was there?
At this time, okay, so there might have been some tunneling done around El Paso. El Paso is notorious for legends about tunnels around El Paso. And these are things that are going back to like the Mexican Revolution, having to do with arms trafficking. At the time, it was prohibited to take arms from the United States into Mexico. There's a revolution going on in Mexico in the 19-teens, and the dictator had all the guns. So the revolutionaries, where did they get their guns from? From the United States. So there's rumors of tunnels around El Paso and why it is going back to the Mexican Revolution regarding arms trafficking. But down here, there was no need for tunnels because the border was so lightly policed. I mean, it's relatively easy to bring things over. There's a lot of shallow parts along the river. Also, like it's relatively easy because people could make little like launches or like little rafts and just wade things across, and that's it. I mean, like the border is you could just walk across it in some places.
When were the first walls? I mean, they're not Trump's walls, they were here long ago.
The first walls that were built across the border, well, they're not walls, they're barbed wire fences. And they're in like Arizona and those places because of like ranching. Oftentimes people have like animals and they would like wander, and they didn't want their animals to wander off, and they would put like a barbed wire fence. So the first fencing along the border was just ranch fencing, barbed wire fences. It also has to do with the fact that, check it out, there's a couple of cases where U.S. ranchers would have like their sheep or their animals, and the animals would like, would look for water, and they go to Mexico. And when they were coming back, the customs agent's like, "You're importing them." And I'm like, "No, they're mine," but you're importing them. And like, that's why those fences originated in the Southwest, but didn't happen in Texas until much, much later. Oh, yes.
In your research, run across any attempts made by the organized crime to get these people, so they were delivering on a more regular basis, kind of a hit and miss type thing?
I think there was an element of organization going on based on the activity I've seen, but I don't have like a record where that was like documented. So for instance, if there are trails, right, that like basically have a terminus at a certain place, which is San Diego, see, that tells me that's the destination, right? And this is something that law enforcement said. A lot of the folk songs say that the guys were going to San Diego. So even like Spanish language sources said this is where they were going. They're going there because that's where there's some roads and connections. You could take a road to Corpus, you could take a road from San Antonio from there. But also like, it's not like they're just gonna go there and wait to see who stops by to pick it up. They're going there to meet someone, which means there's coordination. And that's where like the records kind of like, where are they, right? Like, I don't know how that was coordinated. Like, I'm gonna take, 500 bottles, you're gonna give me, a couple $100, meet me here at this time. It's all done, there's without any kind of like contract, right? You don't want to have that kind of like, you don't want to be found with a document like that. So I know it's happening because they're meeting people. There's appointments, right? There's guys with trucks waiting for them. But like who's managing that? It must be organized crime in like urban cities, because that's where it's going. It's going to Dallas, it's going to Corpus, it's going to San Antonio. So there's speakeasies, bars that are waiting to stock that stuff. And that's who they're supplying, because that wasn't being consumed here. I mean, a lot of stuff that's smuggled here doesn't stay here. It goes to where people want it. Yes, sir.
But there was a connection to the mob, because in my grandfather's time, Al Capone had a house in Mercedes and another one in the town. My father, during the 1960s, would say, that's where the guy from Chicago we used to visit. And my grandfather was a bootlegger. That's the information that we gave him from that, where he got caught in 26. So there was a connection to the mob.
I've heard a lot about Al Capone's house down here, and it's something that I want to look more into. But like my suspicion is there's probably like a lot of people who wanted that alcohol, in terms of like demand.
Well, his house in McAllen is still there. The house in Mercedes got bulldozed early 70s, late 60s. But my dad used to say that he and his dad, which is a bootlegger guy, used to go and visit the guy from Chicago at that particular house. And it was on Rio Rico Road going into Mexico.
I mean, the alcohol that was brought here is very different from Chicago, so it might be something that would have been attractive to some people because like what's crossing the border in Canada is like whiskey, bourbon. Down here it's a very different kind of alcohol.
Well, it was mezcal.
Yeah, it was mezcal, tequila. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Were women involved in smuggling?
There's a person who's writing a book about that. And her name is Carolina Monsiváis, and she works at South Texas College. So let me tell you a little bit about what I found, and then I'm sure at some point she'll come to this museum and she'll tell you what she found. So check this out. What's going on out here is very dangerous, and when officers find men out in the brush country, they're often shot down and killed, right? So the guys I'm studying get killed. But there are a couple of cases that I found women who were involved in liquor smuggling. So I found stories of a woman crossing the border, and the officer at the bridge noticed that she walked kind of funny. And then they asked to look under her skirt. There's a couple of female inspectors at the time, and they find that she has a bladder of alcohol like hidden under her clothing. So it's literally like a pouch that has a bunch of alcohol in it. So I only found a couple of cases of that. And what that tells me is one of two things. Either officers weren't looking for women, or women were just better smugglers. Because if they're not in the record, that means they're not being found, which means maybe they're really good at it, right? Maybe that's why they're not being found. Or officers were not even looking for women. They were really targeting these guys because they saw them as dangerous, right? So, yeah, they were really, really effective. So going back to women, this is what Dr. Monsiváis has found. Dr. Monsiváis has found that women ran a lot of these cantinas where the alcohol was going. So what happens is, where was the alcohol going? Well, people sometimes had a little cantina, a little bar, and women often managed that. So every now and then, as the story you said, like officers would enter people's homes, because sometimes the cantinas were in someone's homes. There's basically, you have a home and then you have like another room in the house, and that's like the bar. And oftentimes women manage that. So check it out. Oftentimes officers, like customs agents, or federal agents would raid these houses, and the women, as women, were able to survive those encounters in a way that men who were out in the monte did not. Because, hey, this is my house you're coming into. This is for my personal consumption. I'm not running a bar, but she has like all these bottles behind the counter. But she said, this is my house. You can't just come in here and this is like for me, because you could have alcohol for personal consumption. You just couldn't sell it. So women were able to more successfully navigate those encounters than the men who were doing this very, very dangerous work were. Yeah, there are some women smugglers, and that's something that I myself want to know more about, but it's fascinating. Yes?
Do you have any other names of bootleggers, smugglers?
I have a few that are in the book. Off the top of my mind, I don't have them immediately at command. So what happens is sometimes, if there's, in the English language newspapers, they're often not given a name. It's like dead smuggler, dead Mexican. It's not descriptive at all. If there's a song, sometimes it's a first name only. Every now and then I'll be speaking to someone who has family that shares personal stories in which a name is provided. Occasionally in the newspaper, there's a name that is given. And in those cases, I put that in the book. So I do have names like Silvano Gracia, not Garcia, it's Gracia, Leandro Viadral, and a few others are named. But oftentimes the names themselves are kind of a escape history. And that's partly because the people who were involved in the activity didn't want their identities to be revealed. But there are a few names in the book, and oftentimes the ones whose names are recorded is because something terrible happened to them that meant their name was preserved.
There's a story of a woman in my family where my great-grandfather was a smuggler. And he lived in Abram, and one of the rivers like very close by. So, as far as I know, he wasn't killed because of that. What he smuggled out, probably anything and everything he could.
Well, I'll tell you a few stories, because like what you said reminded me of some stories of when I was doing my interviews. So his granddaughter became the first female police captain in Laredo. Yeah. So like he died. I talked to his sister, who talked to me about Leandro's granddaughter, Blasita Bloom, who was the first police captain of Laredo, who was a woman. And she's telling me the story. She's the one who gave me this picture and says, look, like my grandfather needed some money, and what he did was illegal, but he was trying to feed his kids. Mm-hmm. That's what she told me. And also the family put the corrido on his monument, which makes me think that we're proud of, that he was a man who was honorable. And there's this tradition that, it's like the Robin Hood tradition, where some crimes are considered to be not wrong because of the law was not just, right? And alcohol was a thing that many people wanted in the United States. That was not, like the moonshiners in Tennessee, it's something that's often valorized. Yes?
I live
in Kansas, which is the other end of the Chisholm Trail. And it's so interesting, the Museum of South Texas, here how the honorable people that wanted to make a life for their family left their kids, whether they went to the gold rush, whether they went to go build the railroad across the United States, or whether they drove the cattle up to Abilene to get on the train. These good people wanted to provide for their family in any way they could. So that's an interesting way to look at it.
I mean, it's dangerous work, you know? And a lot of it, you know what, actually, a lot of it is skilled work too, because like, you know what, let me go back to the story about corridos. So check it out. I think one of the reasons why these corridos valorize tequila runners is that it actually takes a lot of skill to like pack animals. Like you can't just like put it like in the back of a car. Like it's not like, that takes a skill. So to pack like the horses, the animals well, is something that takes a lot of experience and training in ranch work, right? So a skilled packer could put a couple hundred bottles on a mule or donkey. And oftentimes it takes a lot of craft to do it effectively. So for instance, I found stories where the tequileros would put hay between the glass bottles to avoid the clanking, because you could hear it. And it's basically like ringing a bell to come in and get you if you're ringing that. So it takes a skill. And also, I've heard all kinds of stories just by reading like archival material about how intelligent the animals themselves were. So there's this Texas Ranger memoir, and Jesse Bettis was a Texas Ranger in the 19 teens, and he talks about the lone rum-running jackass of Starr County. And this is the story he said. He says like the mules and donkeys, they know the route, and will go to where the watering hole is on their own if they've done it a couple times. So there's this guy who would load his animal at night and let him go, and the animal's in Mexico, and the animal has a lot of alcohol, and the animal would go like a drone by himself to like the United States, and someone would wait for him to pick him up. And that little donkey just did it by himself. You know, he's like homing in, and the officers would find like a lone trail, and it's like, I guess this mule was at it again. Yeah, like you see, just homed in. So I mean, these things take a lot of it's very, very low tech, but it's very effective. Yes.
How much time did Joe Hobrecht get?
Off the top of my mind, I don't remember. I don't think he faced the chair. I'm not sure what happened to him, but like, if he was convicted of killing a federal agent, I don't think he came out again of prison. He probably went to Leavenworth. So smuggling is fascinating because it's a federal offense. So these guys did not serve time in Texas. Later on, there's a federal prison built around El Paso called La Tuna. So some of the guys went there, but many of the guys that I study, they died in these encounters. Right now, I'm working on a book about incarceration. These are people who are involved in like burglary, theft, and these kind of things. I'll tell you a little bit more about myself. So the job I ended up getting after I graduate was a job in Huntsville, Texas. Huntsville, Texas is famous because it has a lot of prisons there. So there's 5 prisons in the city of Huntsville, 7 in the county. The death penalty was enforced 2 blocks from campus. So I taught Texas history, and I took my students to the prison museum as part of like Texas history, right? And I taught the prisons as part of the history of the state. You know, a lot of the students were involved in the guard service. So anyway, I'm working on that right now as my next book project. My mom's like, why do you study that? You know, because it's interesting. You know, like, and also I work with the material that I have at hand. You know, like I try to, like if I'm working someplace, whatever is there, I try to use in terms of writing. Yes.
So the donkey that went itself, how would he get paid? I mean, they would put the money.
I guess if the donkey makes his appointment, the guy who packed the donkey will get payment. Yeah. Yeah. Well,
It was delivered.
yeah, like, so what happens, like this, there's this like anecdotal story in this Texas Ranger memoir. Jesse Bettis talks about the lone rum-running jackasses of Starr County. And he basically says like there'd always be this story of this donkey that did this by himself. And they know that across the border, there was this man who at night would load the donkey and let the donkey go. And at night, the donkey would go by himself and someone was waiting to take the alcohol back. And that guy he was getting paid for it. But that was just one little way that was managed. Now that being said, some would then have to take it to market, but it just showed like just like human ingenuity in terms of just like people's like clever ways of getting around laws they did not like. But it's I think that's how he got paid.
How long was that many mules or whatever, did they have several trains going through, or how far was that spread out as they were trying to go through that?
This is
country?
This is a really impressive photograph, if I don't say so myself, because it's 37 seized animals. 37 seized animals is one of the longest recorded trains seized. So if each animal could carry like, I think 300 bottles. So 37 times 300, that's how many bottles is that? And then if you can get like, I think they were gonna make like about $1,000 off of this. That's $1,000 in like 1921 money. So it's quite a bit of money. And also you have to think that alcohol would later be cut, like diluted to basically make more. So this is what I understand with that. It must have been pretty long. It would take 4 or 5 guys to manage this. So we're talking about, it's not a cattle drive, it's an alcohol drive, right? And they were caught around Duval County, around right here. And I think one of the suspects was wounded, but I don't think they were killed in that encounter. So yeah, I mean, it must have been extensive. So this takes me back to something that I wanted to mention more, but I got caught up in my story. So like, what is through here, right? They're avoiding major cities, so what's out here? Oh, there's something out there. There's ranches. There's ranches out there. So check this out. One of the things that I found out just by doing research is that they did not cut fences. Because if you cut fences, you're gonna have problems with ranchers. And the rancher would either shoot you or report you. So what they did is they made like arrangements with local ranchers and they wouldn't cut fences. There's like a falseta, or basically a way you could lift the wire like with a hook, and then you would come through and then you put the wire back. Because if you start cutting fences and you anger the ranchers, that rancher is not gonna be your ally or turn a blind eye anymore. And oftentimes they would leave a couple of bottles of liquor as payment for that. So, yeah, to cement the deal. But no, I mean, they did not cut fences because cutting fences was a good way to make enemies. That being said, there's a lot of times that ranchers really didn't like them, and they avoided those ranches because obviously they don't want to make the job harder. Because what happens is the animals that the tequilas have sometimes have ticks. And if those animals have ticks, they could infect or expose the cattle, and it would cause those animals to be dipped. So there's like livestock inspectors. So we know that's going on. That's a whole other aspect of the book that I think could be explored more fully about how it's like a livestock issue, with the animals having to be like dipped and those animals with that are coming, the burros might have had little ticks on them. But there's a lot of cooperation and informal stuff, because if they were antagonizing local people, they would not have been successful at all. Yes, sir.
Why the big circle at both gyms?
Yeah.
Everyone always asks me that, and I think that people have told me that we have to think about what was going on at the time. So in the 1920s, there's a couple of like wildcat camps, like oil rigs. And we think that maybe they were like trying to sell to local, like I guess roughnecks is the word, the wildcatters. So I believe that's what that is. And I kind of want to know these are just like, this is an imperfect map, right? This is Ma T. Gillen's map. In my book, I have another map, but a part of me wonders about I would like ranch lines in here, right? I would like some rivers in here and watering holes in here. Mm-hmm. And also like what oil fields were active at that time, because that would be, I think, a much more informative map.
Could those oil fields also have been a distribution point?
I mean,
Because those people would have better
money.
they'd have money, and they'd have people in other places, like other oil producing, they'd have contacts.
Anytime there's an oil field or a lot of men getting paid, there's going to be vice. And we're talking about all kinds of vice, not just alcohol, but the kind of vice that happens around oil fields. And these are things that are a difficult thing to study because how would you to study that? But I think that there's an opportunity to study like, prostitution and these kind of activities because next to a saloon might be, other things that are vice related, right? So, these are fascinating things. And a lot of times it involves looking at federal records, court cases, and then trying to understand the story behind that. And oftentimes there's a lot of like blank pieces on the map that we're trying to understand as best we can with the records. Like a flashlight in a dark room. That's kind of what we do to try to understand the past. Yes, sir.
I take it that this map shows where trips were made, and it probably went as many as 200 miles, did you say?
Okay, this is the thing. This is just the horsebacker map.
Yeah.
So this map is from a book called Horsebacker to the Brush Country by Maud T. Gilliland. And it was a map of mounted liquor smuggling routes. So on the backs of these animals, you can only go so far, right? Because these guys, you can only go so far in an animal. It's not Lonesome Dove, right? So what happens is, at that terminus is where the guys in trucks and cars are waiting for them. So I think that if we look for a map of smuggling routes, it would just be the state road system. It would be that.
Okay.
Because they're just following the roads. Does that make sense?
And they could make about, what, 10 miles or
What?
15 a day?
What you mean
With this mule train, so there's gotta be rivers through there.
Yeah, there's all kinds of little rivers and streams, and of course on the ranches are like watering holes for the animals.
From the border to Duval County, isn't that a couple hundred miles?
I want to say it's about, what is it, like 110 maybe? Well, how much would you say? It depends on the route.
All right, so it represents a period of time of, let's say, 3 days?
It could take a couple, 3 or 4 days. Uh-huh.
Okay. Just imagine for a minute the possibilities of things happening in a scenario where you've got a lot of horses and bottles of stuff. You're gonna have problems, you're gonna have delays, and then they even have cell phones to contact you. So this was sophisticated. So, even though it was low tech, it was very sophisticated.
It was.
In order to make the whole thing click.
Yeah. I mean, the men who were doing this were not novices. These are people from ranching backgrounds. You don't risk your life doing this unless you've worked with animals before and worked with mules and have familiarity with horseback. And also, if you've been, it's difficult in the valley because the valley looks like it's been leveled. It's been leveled to create like a citriculture, like the citrus. But in this region, at that time, it is a thicket. It is a chaparral thicket. We're talking about vegetation that is over my head that will cut you with the thorns. You could disappear in there. So these guys were going through trails and knew where they were going, and there is a lot of sophistication to it. But this is the kind of thing that I want to, that's like the jump that's hard for me to make. Because I don't have I would just die happy with a memoir about day 2. Yeah. This is what happened to me. And it's difficult, but I feel like it's almost like if I read a couple stories about trail drives, it would basically give some context or background about the kind of obstacles they'd face, like snake bites or rain. And, one of the things that happened with Leandro, and this is one of the things that was a delay with him, is that I think he had tuberculosis actually. So he's sick, and this is what happened with him. He's sick and they build a fire, and that's what gets him killed. Because what happens is a lot of times these guys don't build fires. So Leandro is sick, he has a bad cough, and the 2 men, they build a fire, and that's a light. And the encounter says that after they lit the fire, that's when they were gunned down and killed. And we can imagine that if they had not lit the fire because of his ill health, maybe he would not have gotten killed that day. So it's incredibly dangerous. And it's a very, really fascinating time in history. And there's a lot of stuff that I really wish I knew, but you've asked some really, really good questions. Yes, sir.
Did your research discover any, the cattle drives had their rustlers? Did these guys run across bandits trying to take away what they had? Did your research discover any of that?
I mean, I think there's a lot of so one of the fascinating things about organized crime is if you're an organized crime and someone robs from you, you can't call the cops. So they settle their own affairs. So oftentimes, like some of this violence has to do with people settling their own affairs. I will say this, the book has 5 chapters, and in one of my earlier chapters, I talk about rustling. And I'll tell you this, rustlers are not accepted as the way like these guys are, because rustlers, you're taking someone's cattle. Like that is something that people will not accept, versus like alcohol smuggling, which was seen as like not stealing from someone. So like rustlers were met with, were not accepted by locals, versus like alcohol smugglers who oftentimes people turn a blind eye to them. But yeah, so rustling was happening a lot, and I talk about that a little bit in the first chapter, where I'm talking about the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s. But it's a really good question.
Well, I would think there would be people out there trying to steal from these guys, which might explain why the shots were fired first, not knowing they were Texas Rangers.
Yeah, you don't know who's out there. Yeah, rivals. Also, one of the things that's fascinating is there were denunciations where people would basically report on smugglers, and I think it had to do with rivals trying to get rid of competition. There's a couple times when if people don't like the competition, they'll just denounce someone to get rid of people who are cutting into their market. Yes, sir.
Where's your book available?
I have some copies right here. I published the book with the University of Texas Press in 2015. So you can find it on Amazon. And I got 9 copies, and they're for sale for $25, and I'll sign them for you, and if you wish. Yeah, it's a little bit about me and my work, and thank you so much for joining us. And I'll stick around if you have more questions. But it's been an honor to talk to y'all, and I love talking to people who love history.